I said. No, just kidding. All right, thanks so much for coming to our panel. My name is Megan Hatcher-Mays. I'm on the advisory board for Take Back the Court Action Fund, who is sponsoring this illustrious event. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to introduce our panelists who are going to give us their bios and some quick intros, and then we are going to commence the Friar's Roast of the Supreme Court of the United States. So get excited. All the way down to the right, we have Jameson Foley from Take Back the Court Action Fund as well, Brian Beutler from Off Message, Paul Waldman from the Cross Section, and my friend Sasha Rhodes from United for Democracy. Thank you. Jameson, let's start with you. Intro remarks?
Sure. Is this? Okay. So I'm Jameson. As Megan said, I'm an advisor at Take Back the Court. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Take Back the Court Action Fund, sorry, we exist for one reason, and that's that the Republican supermajority on the Supreme Court is waging a war on the basic freedoms and well-being of the American people and on democracy itself. And in order to stop them, we have to take their power away by expanding and rebalancing the court. When I started with Take Back the Court 5 years ago this month, there was a deeply entrenched conventional wisdom that Republican voters are energized by the court and Democratic voters aren't. And I think that was largely because Republican politicians had been campaigning and yelling about the court for decades and Democrats hadn't. But regardless of the reason, that was kind of the conventional wisdom. This was a politically salient and beneficial topic for Republicans, but not for Democrats. And there was some truth to that. And so when people would ask me if I thought Democrats should campaign on the Supreme Court, people I knew in Democratic politics who were running campaigns, I'd say, look, I think that as a court reform advocate, I think that it's important that we talk about court reform in a campaign context because that is a really important step in laying the groundwork to reforming the court, which we need to do. But that in most close races, it probably wasn't going to be one of the most salient and effective issues for Democrats to talk about at that point. If you're prioritizing, your campaign resources, it probably wasn't going to be the most effective issue for Democrats to campaign on. That was 5 years ago. Things have changed. Things have changed a lot. And this week, I actually just wrote in my newsletter a piece arguing that Democrats should treat the Supreme Court as Donald Trump's running mate. This draws a little bit on my experience in 1996 when I was working at the DNC for the Clinton campaign, and we just acted like Newt Gingrich was Bob Dole's running mate, because people hated Newt Gingrich. He was awful. And he was awful in a way that amplified Bob Dole's own weaknesses and brought some new weaknesses to the table. And I think the Supreme Court has that potential for us to do the same kind of thing with Donald Trump. The court's own flaws and unpopularity amplifies Trump's, and it can help fill in some of the gaps in the public's understanding about his responsibility for things like abortion bans that are taking place. So that's a massive shift in my own thinking, and it's because there's been a massive shift in the politics of the court. And I think that some of that is because of the work that we've done at Take Back the Court, that UFD is doing under Sasha's leadership, that Indivisible did when Megan was running their court's work. Other organizations like Demand Justice and People's Parity Project have been doing great work highlighting the problems with the court and educating the American people about that. But the most credit really goes to the Supreme Court itself and the Republican justices on the court. I've said for years that the Supreme Court is essentially the legal department of the RNC, but it's also the communications department of the court reform movement. Their wildly unpopular and deeply un-American decisions, their flamboyant corruption, has really turned the public against them and handed Democrats a really effective campaign message if we pick it up and use it. That's all for now.
Thanks. Brian?
Thanks, everyone. I'm Brian Beutler with Off Message, and thanks to Jameson, because what he said tees up what I'm going to say pretty well, and I'm going to say some similar things, but I think my big idea about how Democrats can exploit the new politics of the court is just a little different. So before the session is out, we'll probably be able to touch on different court reform ideas, expansion versus jurisdiction stripping or whatever else, and the politics of each one of them. But the name of the panel is Why Democrats Should Campaign Against the Supreme Court. And so I want to take a few minutes and talk about why that's probably a matter now of raw political necessity rather than just one option Democrats have among many. When Jameson actually reached out to me to participate in this panel, Joe Biden was maybe generously tied in the race against Donald Trump. And questions of whether and why and how to campaign on anything, as Jameson was just alluding to, kind of turn to some extent on whether you're winning or losing, right? And if you've got a big lead, you might weigh the substantive importance of court reform against the old maxim, if it's not broke, don't fix it, and then maybe make the strategic decision not to upset the apple cart. But now Biden's behind again. There's a big crisis of confidence in him as a candidate. And this all becomes academic if he loses, right? You can't make even the tiniest reforms to the court if he loses. So the bad news is we don't have a ton of helpful history to help us sort out where campaigning on the court fits into a campaign that's losing. But the good news is that the history we do have is pretty promising. We know a presidential candidate who's lost the confidence of his congressional party can win because Donald Trump did it 8 years ago. Obviously, the Comey letter had a lot to do with that, and maybe the less said about Jim Comey, the better here. But Trump didn't just cool his heels after the Access Hollywood tape came out. He did a few other things too. First, he paid off his mistresses. Second, he redoubled his efforts to fill the media environment with swing voter-friendly attacks on Hillary Clinton. The third thing he did was remind the religious right of the devil's bargain they'd already made with him. If you vote for me, you get Neil Gorsuch. There's a vacancy on the court right now. Just set your misgivings aside and I'll do it for you. Well, Biden doesn't have mistresses to pay off as far as we know, and Democrats have lots of ways to attack him in, it's not that funny. He could.
Take the laugh.
Okay, but and Democrats have lots of ways to attack Donald Trump that swing voters, that might resonate with swing voters. But since Dobbs, and maybe even a little before Dobbs, the court has flipped from being an issue that benefits Republicans to one that benefits Democrats. So running against the court is Biden's opportunity to replicate that third flank of Trump's comeback strategy. He can say Trump built this court, that's true. That the court took away Roe versus Wade, also true. And that he will make it federal law, but he can't do that unless he's reelected and he has a Democratic Congress that'll pass the bill he needs to do that. And so at bottom, that's a campaign against both Trump and this court. And Biden has shown he's comfortable with that line. He used it ahead of the 2022 midterms. He's used it now and again since this campaign has began. And if he remains determined to stay in the race, I think will transform into the most powerful rhetorical tool he has to remobilize his base, which is now demoralized.
Thanks, Brian. Paul?
Hi, everyone. I am Paul Waldman, and I will just take a second to plug all my things, because I have a lot of different things. My Substack is called The Cross Section, and I write columns for MSNBC and for heatmap.news, which is a great climate site that everyone should check out. And I do a podcast with my sister called Boundary Issues. When I talk about the Supreme Court, I tend to get very worked up and angry and start talking very fast. I will try to keep a lid on that. But it's hard not to. I look back at some of the stuff I've written in the past. In 2016, 8 years ago, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post where I was then a columnist saying, that was titled something like why Democrats need to make the Supreme Court a big issue in this year's election. And 4 years later in 2020, I wrote another piece with virtually the same title, urging Democrats to make the Supreme Court a big issue in that year's election. It didn't happen. As JMO said, things have changed now, and Dobbs has basically kind of opened up a conversation with regular people, I think, in a way that it hadn't been. I mean, the Supreme Court it can be hard to communicate to normies who don't think a lot about politics why it is political and why it is so important. They just see it as kind of, a bunch of people who are judges who make decisions on these kind of arcane issues that are difficult to understand, and their judgments have this kind of weight of authority that doesn't really come into question in the political realm. And Dobbs sort of blew all that up, because now people are seeing, oh yes, this actually affects my life, the lives of people that I love, and it made a difference that Donald Trump got to appoint 3 justices in his one stinking term, and now we have this 6-3 supermajority that is doing all kinds of things. Now, it's still hard to explain to people why Chevron deference, for instance, is going to make a difference in their lives. But at least you can now start to have that conversation because people have seen something very specific and concrete that the court did that changed a lot of things for tens of millions of people. And now you can begin to explain to them, well, this matters too. I think that this is one of the reasons that this is so important is because we are in this kind of epic struggle for power. And the Supreme Court has, especially in this last term, just taken for itself extraordinary power away from the democratically elected branches, both Congress and the presidency when they choose to, i.e. when there's a Democrat in the White House, that they have said, we are going to be the ones who decide on all of these policy questions. We're going to be the ones who decide whether or not people can buy certain kinds of guns. We're going to be the ones who decide whether or not you're allowed to have clean air and clean water. We are going to be the ones who make all of these decisions, even down to the most minute things, if we decide that we don't like what the other 2 branches have done. And they are the people who are least able to make those decisions. So it is something that all Americans should be angry about. But hopefully we're going to have some good ideas for how to talk about that in ways that even those of us in this room who are so tuned in, and I'm sure everybody, whether you're an activist knocking on doors or even just talking to your friends and family, you've run into this problem where you kind of have trouble communicating it in a compelling way to people who are not so tuned in. And I hope we can kind of break through that in ways that are useful for people.
I didn't know we were bringing our ideas. I thought we were just bringing our frustrations to this panel, because that's really all I had.
That's the starting
This is a
point.
catharsis, yes.
That's what I brought to this panel. Hi, everyone. I'm Sasha Rhodes, Executive Director of United for Democracy. It is an honor to be here with my friends on this panel to talk about running against the Supreme Court. I have so many feelings about this. I think obviously we all have frustrations about the court. I have some, I'm just going to be honest, since we're with friends, most of my frustrations are with Democrats. There's a common thread that exists in the presentations before me. Most of these folks have been working to talk about why we should be paying attention to the Supreme Court. And at the end of their remarks, they're like, now we have a chance to do it. And it's because Democrats often wait to go where the ball is instead of planning to go where the ball will be. And I have a number of feelings about why that may be the case. But I think for this particular piece, one important thing is that we are also afraid of capturing power. And apparently that word has been a dirty word for Democrats, but it shouldn't be, because capturing power is the only way we will be able to deliver for the people we care most about and for all of us. And so thank you. We launched United for Democracy a year ago with 140 organizations are members. They all work on a number of different issues, so repro, climate, the economy, a number of different pieces, with the idea that we have got to show everyday folks, I hate that term, but go with me for now, outside of our political elite circles, that the Supreme Court is a power center for all the issues that they care about. And so we have to be able to sort of take that message outside of Washington and on to kitchen tables across America if we're ever going to make this a real issue for us. The right, as we all know, has executed a 40-year strategy to capture our federal courts. And a key part of their strategy has been to communicate to their base that the Supreme Court is the place that will deliver for them on those issues, right? So their voters know that if you want to protect babies, then the Supreme Court's the place. If you're going to protect traditional marriage, the Supreme Court's the place. We've not done that, and I think even worse, we've sort of held the Supreme Court in this wonderful, respectable place off to the right or left or in the middle, hoping to protect all the things that we care about. And that's just not the case. That's not what the Supreme Court is or really has been. And so I think we had a number of opportunities to make the Supreme Court sort of fixture in how we talk about delivering for our folks. We've missed that opportunity, and now we have a chance because they've been stripping away our rights and freedoms left and right. And I think Dobbs opened the door for us to say, yes, that sucks, but also they're coming for climate change, gun violence prevention, the economy, and a number of things. And as Paul mentioned, they are taking power away from the other branches right before our eyes. While we sort of argue about culture wars, they are changing the rules and being able to strip away the progress that we've been able to make. And so as hard as that is and as dark as that may sound, I do feel like we now have an opportunity because people are paying attention. And I will say this is a surprise, and I don't mean this in a negative way. Some people are not excited about the Biden presidency. And they need something else to vote for. And we've been saying that democracy is our candidate. And in order to sort of save democracy, we will need to be able to run on why we have to fix this court, and we cannot allow Donald Trump to appoint another justice. And I think we have an opportunity to do that. So I'm excited. I hope I bring more than my frustration to this panel too.
Thanks, Sasha. We're going to get into some questions, but first I just wanted, again, to reiterate, we just wrapped up this disastrous Supreme Court term with rulings on everything from workers' rights to abortion, guns, and this wide-ranging ruling in a case called Relentless, which both Sasha and Paul have mentioned that could, very well likely will, permanently kneecap the federal government's ability to regulate corporate fraudsters, unscrupulous bosses, clean water and clean air. I don't know if you all are interested in those things. If anyone drinks water here, let me know. Guns and a whole lot more. But you may not have heard it framed as a particularly disastrous Supreme Court term because in some of these cases the court didn't reach the most extreme possible outcome. And when that happens, the press just jumps at the chance to be like, yay, you're not as bad as everyone thinks. And they get really overly congratulatory that the court moderated itself. So, for example, in the Idaho abortion ban case, the court ultimately dismissed this case as improvidently granted and allowed a lower court ruling that put the ban on pause to go into effect. This is not a good result. And in fact, Alito in his dissent said, we're just waiting for a more politically opportune time for this case. If you don't believe me, you can look it up. He said that. He's basically inviting a future challenge, just like this one, except when Trump is president would be ideal for them. But the press presented this as a victory for abortion rights because it wasn't the worst possible thing that could happen. And so the press is running kind of interference almost for the court, trying to uphold it as this nonpartisan institution. Not every member of the press, but some, the established press in particular. Fortunately, what we're seeing is that American voters are seeing the court for what it is. It's a deeply flawed, very right-wing institution that is ruled by this MAGA faction who will really stop at nothing to roll back our fundamental rights. They've already done it, and they're going to continue to do it. They're telling us in black and white, in paper, that they want to do more, but they just need a better political environment to do it. And they're being supported in this effort by the same people who support Donald Trump's campaign, these billionaires who then lavish them with these great rewards for having done their bidding. So they get to go on cool boat trips and private jets and drink fancy wine, and they get to be in paintings, which is like so cool.
It's just a gratuity.
Yeah, it's just a commonplace billion-dollar gratuity. That, by the way, they also ruled this term that bribery is fine. Not a joke. So voters are seeing this, but Democrats don't seem to want to do anything about it, to Stasha's point. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Democrats actually hold the gavel in the Senate. Did you guys know this? Are you seeing this?
No, I didn't know. I wasn't aware.
Like, the Judiciary Committee has the ability to hold these justices accountable, but Dick Durbin, for many of his own reasons that I don't understand, doesn't want to do it. So, the question on the table today here at this panel, today's panel is about the danger that the court poses, the politics surrounding the court, and why Democrats should campaign against it, because it is a waking nightmare that we all live with every day. So, let's start. I will start with you, Stasha. How are activists and the public at large reacting to what the Supreme Court is doing, and what does that tell us about whether and how Democrats should pursue the court as a campaign issue?
I'm actually I'm actually really proud of activists. I know that I said I'm frustrated with Democrats. I meant that as like our elected leaders. I'm actually really proud of activists and advocates on this issue. I think that over the past 5 to 10 years, we've shifted the Overton window on making reforms even a part of the conversation. And so the fact that we are seriously talking about things like court expansion and term limits and ethics is due because of, in part, the court's bad, but also because advocates have been really pushing the needle on this and talking about how we have to reform the court. I don't want to understate that, though. I think it's important for people to know that narrative change is how you change policy, and being able to change the conversation is core to making things possible. And so I think sometimes folks believe that either these things just inevitably happen, and that's not the case. I think advocates have done a really good job to shift the conversation. There's some folks who I think are doing some going where the ball will be conversations to shift that window a bit more. I think I saw Molly Coleman in the audience. I might have made that up. I thought I saw her. Who's working on disempowering reforms to figure out how do we take away this power that this court keeps giving itself. And I think that's important to shift the conversation. So I will say, one, advocates are doing a really good job at communicating why we need to critique and fix this court. I think we can all do a better job of taking our message outside of our circles, as I mentioned earlier. I think now that people are paying more attention to the court, we need to really pounce and not just tell them how bad the court is and explain what it's doing, which I think is incredibly important, but we have to point the finger and blame the folks who built and empower this court. And I think maybe J-Mo might have mentioned this in his early remarks, but we all know that Trump wanted to appoint those justices to take away abortion rights. Not many Americans know that. In fact, less than 24% of Americans who are likely voters blame Trump. Less than 24%. That's a problem. And they are all pissed about abortion. And so I think we can do a better job of talking about who's responsible for building and empowering this court and what that means.
Thank you. This is a follow-up for everyone. I think, like, if it's good politics for Dems to run on the courts, then why don't they? I guess I'm curious if you think, is it outdated thinking about the court? I think this is touched upon in some of your opening remarks, that folks on the left tend to think of the court as this institution that has granted us rights. Like, if you ask your average person to just name a Supreme Court case, they'll probably say Brown v. Board. They might say Roe v. Wade. Those are cases that granted rights, expanded our understanding of constitutional rights. Is it that? Are the Dems too just used to ignoring the court as a political concept, or is it something else? Anybody can jump in.
I mean, I think it's both of those and more. I do think, and I should acknowledge, by the way, I think we've seen some Democrats get better on this a lot in the last couple of years. We've seen some that are really tremendous leaders on this. Senator Tina Smith, Representative Ocasio-Cortez. Like, there is some work being done and some really good leadership being demonstrated. I also have been frustrated from time to time at the Democrats' failure to use the powers that they have as committee chairs, for example, to be a little more aggressive. Some good signs even on that front. Like, Dick Durbin's now talking about hearings in September about the immunity decision. I think a lot of us probably saw that and thought, well, it's fucking mid-July. Why are we waiting until September? Sorry. And that's my first thought, but I will also say that September is not a bad time to focus attention on the Supreme Court in when, you know, the presidential campaign is really underway and people are paying close attention. So if they do it well, I don't necessarily mind that they're doing it in September until now. That's if they do it well. But so there are some signs of progress. I think that Democrats overall, you know, to paint with a broad brush, have been kind of slow to realize the nature of some of the threats that we face and the challenges and nature of the Republican Party and the nature of how thoroughly captured the Supreme Court has been, and still like to think of it as, you know, as Sasha said, sort of this independent, high-minded institution that's above politics. Doesn't help that the news media certainly treats it that way. I could spend 3 days on that topic, but I won't, because that's not the topic of this panel, despite my every instinct. But some is just, I think, a lack of creativity and a lack of seeing how it can connect. Like when you're prioritizing in a campaign, you're thinking, okay, well, obviously we all think we should talk about abortion, right? That's been extremely effective for Democrats for a couple cycles now for very good reasons. So you have abortion, maybe we're going to talk about healthcare. They haven't made the connection to the Supreme Court isn't something that takes away from those issues, it's additive. Sasha mentioned the 24% who blame Trump for abortion bans. She stole a stat I was going to mention, but in fairness, I think she initially flagged it for me a few months ago. The other part of that is that 14% blame Joe Biden and hold Joe Biden accountable and responsible for it. And I think that goes to a basic problem that we have and need to overcome, which is that if you're paying any kind of close attention at all, I think you have a pretty good understanding of the nature of the court these days, or at least what it's been doing to hurt people. But if you haven't been paying attention, it's not immediately obvious why abortion bans that resulted from a Supreme Court decision that occurred while Joe Biden was president are Donald Trump's fault. And there was a New York Times article last fall that contained a quote that has haunted me ever since of a young voter, it was a young woman in, I think, Nevada, who was leaning towards voting for Trump, despite the fact that abortion rights were the most important issue to her. And she said that she thought that this was Joe Biden's fault because the court decision came during his presidency. And that's, on the one hand, infuriating and deeply frustrating. But it's also a really easy fix. Like, this isn't arcane minutia of tax policy that we somehow have to figure out how to explain to people. We just have to tell them, look, Donald Trump promised to appoint justices who would overturn Roe. He did. They did. He bragged about it. It's a very simple story. So it's a challenge, but it's one with, I think, a simple, if not easy, solution. It's not easy because we have to repeat it over and over again and all the time, and we have a lot to overcome there. But the mechanics of it are simple. The thing is simple. It's a simple explanation.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing about why
Yes.
I think Democrats are squeamish about court reform versus other ideas kind of peripheral to the court? Is the Democratic Party, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, has become deeply beholden to people who call themselves data scientists. And when something like the Dobbs decision lands, people freak out, and then abortion bans begin rolling out across the country. People get really upset by that. Democrats poll the environment. They find that restoring reproductive rights is popular. But if they poll court reform, less popular, and it's definitely something that gets Republican voters invested in stopping the court reformers. So when court reform comes up as an idea, the leadership in the party says we should stick with the popular ideas and we should protect our frontline members by not defining ourselves by the more radical idea. And there's a surface level logic to it, but it doesn't really work one-to-one, right? Like when Republicans put forth a budget that says we want to privatize Medicare or we want to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Democrats find that's really unpopular, they go out and run against it, and then they still lose the election. It's when Republicans actually set about trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, people wake up, and suddenly the Affordable Care Act itself becomes popular, efforts to save it become popular, and the party can unify and actually do the right thing, right? Protect the Affordable Care Act, don't negotiate to weaken it in any way. And I think that with the Supreme Court behaving the way it is, they can fast forward 20 years. It doesn't have to be like the filibuster where it took 20 years to get the party in line for filibuster reform. You can just wait for the Supreme Court's next decision, right? If Democrats codify Roe v. Wade, I think it's better than even odds that the Supreme Court will say that law is unconstitutional. And then what are you going to do? Then you have to have the conversation about reforming the court. And then you have to ideally get the leadership in the Democratic Party to stop shutting the conversation down just because it doesn't poll quite at 60% yet. You want them to calm the jitters of the frontline members who are worried about this controversial issue so that there's space for it if and when the Supreme Court says you can't have reproductive rights even if a supermajority in Congress says you can. Normally I would say that I fear this will take 2 decades, but because the court is so unhinged, I think that if you have a Democratic trifecta and the court doesn't reverse itself in some way, that we could speed up that process quickly.
If I could add just
please.
a couple things. First of all, I think that a lot of liberals are still captive to an idea that was never true and is certainly outdated, which is that too many people believe that the Supreme Court is fundamentally an institution that is kind of liberal. It protects people's rights, including minority rights. That has never been true. It has always, throughout American history, been an institution that protects the powerful. And there was this little window of time, maybe between Brown v. Boer and Roe v. Wade, when they were doing some good stuff. But even if you think that was the primary where it was at that point, it has always been an institution that protects the powerful, and now it is a deeply reactionary institution. And I just want to say one other thing. I love the metaphor Sasha used of going where the ball is. This is something that Republicans understood. It enabled them to create one of the most extraordinary political successes in American history, which is that back in the 1980s, they had a realization that if we can get the courts, especially the Supreme Court, that's the truest center of power. Because not only do they have more power to overrule the other two branches than the other two branches have over them, but when you get it, you can hold it for decades. There's not going to be an election in 4 years. You can hold it for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and they set about in a very methodical way to say, it doesn't matter for us if this takes us 30 years to capture the courts. We're going to do it. We're going to invest our money and our time and get everybody on our side to agree that this is a goal that we need to accomplish. And it did take them 30 years. But guess what? Now we're seeing the results. And I think, to what Brian said, oftentimes Democrats get so focused on this latest poll says that we need to focus on this kitchen table issue, and that pushes everything else aside. And these really long-term things that will ultimately make the biggest difference just get shunted to next election, next election, next election. And so it's important for liberals, especially the activist base, because that's where it's going to come from, to make sure that they are thinking about that long-term and what is going to make the biggest difference over the course of decades.
I'm so sorry.
Please.
I was going to be quiet, but
No,
Paul's
please.
good points, I just want to say quick.
This is the roast of the Supreme Court. Please continue.
Paul made I think amazing points about everyone did, but the point that I just have been trying to beat the drum on about making sure that we are not constantly moved by cycle and not letting electoral cycles dictate what our action plans are. And I think this sort of meets another point that I think I want us to be better about is we don't all have to be doing the same things, right? So some people can be focused on the long term. Some folks can be really focused on how do we win. We have to be. How do we win elections? Some people have to be able to talk to the political elite. Some people have to talk. We don't all have to do the same things. But I think when we are pressuring our friends and other peer organizations that, aren't you doing this? Didn't you hear? We should drop everything that you were planning for 30 years down the road because that's not important right now. Trump's the nominee. And I think we have to be better. They are not moved by short-term wins or losses. They plan and then 30 years reap the benefits, and they're happy about that. And so I just think not to celebrate them, but I think we can learn some of those lessons.
I think that's right. This kind of leads me to my next question. I guess I just feel like there's a lot, there seems to be this kind of conflation that, court reforms aren't popular, so we shouldn't talk about the court at all, which I think is an incorrect conclusion to come to, right? Where actually the court is deeply unpopular. I think this is the least popular the court has ever been since people started polling it, which is really saying something because they've sucked for a really long time, as Paul mentioned. And I just wonder, because some of the messages that we've seen resonating is people across the board really hate when people in power abuse that power. Yeah. And this anti-corruption messaging against the court actually pulls even better than when you tell people that the court is responsible for overturning Roe v. Wade. People hate that shit. They hate when somebody very powerful gets a free boat ride to Alaska or whatever it was, right? And yet there continues to be this fear to kind of make that connection in people's minds and voters' minds about the court that does this stuff, who influences the court, and who rewards them when they do it. And so this question is for you, JMO, but really anyone, please feel free to jump in. I think we're kind of surrounded by these messes that have been created or exacerbated by the MAGA justices. Everything from the environment to weaken labor laws, but voters don't always make that connection between the court and this loss of their fundamental rights. So how can Democrats better make those connections for people?
Yeah, we've talked about a little bit of that already. I think the connection to the court being, and Donald Trump being responsible for the court and intentionally so overturning Roe and the abortion bans that come from that. Just saying that, just telling people, just reminding people, like little steps like that. But to back up even a step from there, and I was reminded of this by something Paul said, a really basic fact about the Supreme Court that not as many people know as we might all hope is that Republicans control it. Marquette University does the most frequent, kind of regular and consistent polling on the Supreme Court. And in their poll a couple of months ago, they asked just which party's presidents do you think nominated the majority of the Supreme Court justices? Only 37% of Americans were sure that it was Republicans, that a majority of the court was appointed by Republicans. A quarter thought that it was probably Democrats. We did at Take Back the Court a couple years ago a poll in which we tried to get a sense of, we tried to measure how long people thought it had been since Democrats last controlled the Supreme Court. So we asked like an open-ended question, just how many years do you think it's been since Democrats last had a majority on the court? I don't remember the exact totals, but it was like a dozen essentially, like 12 years or so was the most, the average. It's been 55 years. It's been 55 consecutive years of Republicans controlling the Supreme Court. It's been a little while since I've done the math. This keeps changing as, demographics change, but roughly 70% of Americans weren't even born yet the last time we didn't have a Republican Supreme Court. Republicans have controlled the court for a very long time. People don't know that. We can tell them. We can tell them, and then when we tell them and the Supreme Court does things that piss them off, they'll know who to blame. They'll know which party to connect that to in elections. But we haven't been telling them as much as we should. We've been assuming that they know it, or we've been pretending that the court is not actually a political entity. Of course it is. Of course it is. Sam Alito, Clarence Thomas, Brett Kavanaugh. These are not, come on. That's all I'm going to say about Brett Kavanaugh.
I was going to say, I wish we could bring up the photo of Karl Rove and Brett Kavanaugh hugging each other on the tarmac on the way to Air Force One. Like, these are not like nonpartisan. This is not an issue of, we just have passing disagreements on, statutory interpretation. These guys are like political hacks who went to law school, have the technical, resume to be on the Supreme Court, and that's why they got picked, because they're going to do favors for their political benefactors, which is what we see them doing. JMO, I know you said this isn't a panel about the media, but actually, I have a question about the media. This is for Paul and Brian. I mean, I talked about this a little bit before, but the media has a role to play here too. And I think sometimes, often, maybe, established legal reporters seem to have this very strong desire to run interference for the court. Like, the court's not crazy, don't listen to the activists, they're being hysterical. It's actually very normal, and I love it when people trot out actually the court agrees with each other 80% of the time, or whatever it is, and then the other 20% is like all the shit you actually care about. Like the other 20% of stuff they don't agree on is like abortion, voting, going to school, that kind of thing. So, for example, I think this was just yesterday or earlier this week, New York Times Supreme Court reporter Adam Liptak said that the Supreme Court rulings on the Idaho abortion ban, which I mentioned before, because they didn't say, yeah, go ahead and ban abortion, that had effectively enhanced access to abortion. So I just am curious, I'd love to hear from you two about what role does the media play in reporting on the court, and how does that affect the politics surrounding the institution?
Well, I can start. So part of the problem is that sort of the way that news organizations are structured, because when a decision comes down from the court, who writes about it? It's their Supreme Court reporter, right? And that person is, very kind of has a bias toward those sorts of interpretations where it's very kind of, they're invested in the institution too, and that everything is basically okay, and they don't want to see it as political. They're going to explain the details of the decision and the precedents at play and all those things like that. And they're not going to come out and say, holy shit, they're taking away people's rights, or that this lunatic decision on guns is going to cause mass chaos in lower courts, which is what happened with Bruin. By the way, just as an aside, every one of these cases, this is one of the things that's so striking. There's a dissent from the liberals that will say, do you understand what the effects of this are going to be? And then the majority comes back and says, oh, come on. And the liberals are always right. But anyway, so then you have this very small number of Supreme Court reporters who basically are kind of very conservative, just small c conservative in the way that they approach this. They're not gonna like blare the alarms when things that do warrant it happen. And the other side of that is the political reporters are only going to talk about that stuff when it intrudes on the political world. And that's why it's important that politicians on the Democratic side make a big stink out of it. When, whoever it is, Hakeem Jeffries comes out and says, this is a 5-alarm fire, then the political reporters who cover him are going to talk about it. And so that's why it's important to make sure that the people who are the political people who are getting covered by a different body of reporters who will just kind of repeat what they say to a certain extent, that those people raise the alarms too.
Yeah, I'm going to second a lot of what you said, but sometimes I feel like reporting on politics in the United States would be better if big news outlets brought their foreign desk reporters in to coach them a little bit on what they would write about if what's happening in the United States was happening somewhere else, right? If a foreign democratic leader tried to overturn an election to stay in power and then ran for office again, and then 3 Supreme Court justices that leader appointed said, no, you can't try this former president before the next election, I think the foreign desk would say that is the continuation of a coup. That is continuing to happen. It's not 6 jurists disagreeing with 3 others about what presidential powers are. It's they're helping him avoid accountability for trying to overthrow the government. And so in that sense, it's really like we can't make the media better. The media has to make itself better. And maybe we can just write media criticism about it, and eventually they'll listen. But I really do want to echo what Paul said about how political reporters respond to what lawmakers and other influential people do. They don't necessarily have really great radars for understanding what's important. They can be made to treat something as scandalous by observing how the people involved act. And if Elena Kagan had taken $2 million in gifts from George Soros, I think there'd be some hearings in the House of Representatives about it.
Yep. Subpoenas, all of that.
And if I think it would change a lot of the coverage if people like Chuck Schumer and Dick Durbin, they don't even need to come out and say, we're going to expand the court if we win the election and turn it into this big controversy, but they can say there's going to have to be a reckoning for the Scalia seat and for the Ginsburg seat and for Dobbs. We don't know what it's going to look like yet, but we are not just going to take those kicks to the teeth over and over and over again and not do anything about it. And saying that would motivate reporters to cover it as like a live controversy. And separately, it would, the people who support them or whose votes they're counting on be like, okay, at least you get that there's something that has to be done here. And in my experience, Democrats, as unresponsive as they are to criticism and pressure, are more responsive than the press, so.
And can I hop in there just 1 second to follow up on something Brian said, and also, Megan just said the word subpoenas, which is one of my favorite words, when directed in a certain direction. To circle back, Megan, to your question earlier about like why aren't Democrats doing more? Why aren't they more aggressive? I think the subpoena question is a good thing to focus on there for a second. And one reason we talked about a little bit about earlier is I don't think they've been fast enough to understand the nature of what's going on. But another is I think they don't like to lose fights. And I think that they know that if they issue subpoenas, which they've done in some cases, Harlan Carrillo or whoever, Clarence Thomas certainly, if they subpoena Clarence Thomas or Ginny Thomas, they're not going to comply with it. And they can try to enforce it. They can try to hold them in contempt of Congress. It's going to end up in, if anything ends up in the Supreme Court, we know how they're going to rule. Bottom line is they're not going to successfully drag Clarence Thomas in to testify, and they're not going to send him to prison. It's not going to happen. And so they don't want to pick that fight because they'll lose it. And they think they'll look weak. And I think they look weak by not picking it.
Correct.
I think that picking it I think when they pick that fight, they make it a high-profile fight, and everybody in America can see which party it is that wants to let a Supreme Court justice who is jetting around the world on a private jet that he's not disclosing, paid for by billionaires who have interest in cases before the court, like which party it is that's shielding that guy from accountability.
That's right.
And so you lost the short-term fight because you didn't successfully get him in to testify, and he's not in prison for contempt of Congress, but you won a longer fight. You demonstrated to the American people how corrupt this guy is and how corrupt the party is that put him in place and keeps him in place.
That's right. I have an example of this I think was pretty successful. It wasn't a perfect messaging opportunity because Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are annoying. But Democrats picked a fight on the For the People Act, too, the same thing, because they knew every single Republican would vote against it, and they knew they were going to lose, but they did it anyway, because it's worth having that message point of every single Republican voted against our democracy today. Right. And when it comes to subpoenas, that theoretically could end up on a floor vote, too. Every single Republican voting to protect these corrupt
Right.
people who are taking money to rule in certain ways, who are taking gifts as rewards for taking away our fundamental rights, that's a fight worth picking, so I'm glad that you brought that up. I have one last question, and I think we can take questions from you all if you have any. I think we've decided that Democrats should campaign against the court, so good job.
We won.
But I have a question about specific reforms, and it's this. I guess it depends on what day you catch me. Some days I wake up and I think there's all these reforms we could do, and if you did all these things, then the court would work, and I could be at peace at long last. My mind would be like a rainbow and a unicorn inside, instead of like a bog of despair, which it is now. And then some days I wake up and I think, but why are my rights dependent on who sits on the Supreme Court? Why is that? So the only way that I can have my fundamental rights is if at least 5 people who are nice decide that I get to have them. No, that doesn't make any sense either, does it? Should we just abolish the Supreme Court? Maybe we don't reform it. Maybe we get rid of it. Some days I wake up and I think, was Marbury wrongly decided? You know? Why do these people even have a review over congressionally passed, democratically elected people's laws? Like, that's crazy. So I think the question is, okay, we've all decided Democrats should campaign against the courts. Well done. But should they run on specific reforms? Should they run on reforming the court at all? Or should they run on, screw these guys, we're abolishing it? Your thoughts, panel.
I think they should add 1,000 seats to
Yes.
the Supreme Court.
I think they should have 1,001.
Price is Right.
Sorry, it's the closest without going over, J-Mo. Sorry, you do not win the recliner.
I actually just want to circle back quickly to something Sasha said earlier. We can do different things, and I think this is, and we can talk about the same broad thing in slightly different ways. And I think this is a really great example of this. I think the Supreme Court is such a powerful potential campaign issue for Democrats, and there's a spectrum of how powerful that can be and in what ways, right? And if there's a Democrat running somewhere who doesn't know where they are yet on reforms, great. You can still do some good by just telling people how bad the court is and what it's doing and making that connection. If there is a Democrat who's ready to embrace or has a reform agenda, like that adds some strength to it because people will see you're taking this problem seriously. You have solutions that are sufficient to the scale of the problem. I think that is a better approach in many cases. You know, expansion, which I'm for, and for a lot of reforms actually, but expansion is sort of a necessary first one. It demonstrates that you're taking this seriously. You have solutions that meet the scale of the problem. I think that's a really important thing. But I do think that there's room for like, a lot of different approaches. If we're all talking about the Supreme Court, that's a really good topic to have in front of people, even if we're not yet all in the same place on exactly how we're talking about it or what our solutions are.
Yeah,
The
and you don't
sub-point
have
is
to
you got to talk about it. You
Right.
can't just run away from the
Right.
problem.
You don't have to get everybody to agree on the specific reform. If some people want just to have term limits, and some people want to do expansion, if you get a lot of people talking about how the Supreme Court might change, that just opens people's minds up to the idea that it doesn't have to be this way, and maybe some kind of reform is something that you can get behind. And that takes some time to get people used to that idea, because when it comes to these institutions, like it's just, this is the way I learned it was when I was in grade school and everything, you have to just sort of open up people's minds to the possibility, and then we can argue about exactly which one would be preferable. But the more you can get, even if you get to the point where like every Democratic candidate is going to have to say, well, yeah, obviously I support Supreme Court reform, and maybe I like this idea more than that one. If you do that, then you've like taken 2 giant steps down the road.
my favorite plan is for Democrats to embed a measure in the Women's Choice Protection Act that says if this law is struck down by the court, we're going to take 2 seats off the court, the oldest serving members. So that's Clarence Thomas and John Roberts get to go home, and now it's a 4-3 court.
Sensational. Sasha?
I'm so happy, Brian. Brian makes me moderate, and I like that. I think that we have to get a lot of the reforms, as I mentioned earlier. I'm very proud that they're out in the ecosystem and being pushed and talked about. And by the way, a lot of that's because of some of the Megan, J-Mo, a lot of folks are in here who have done that work. So it's incredible, I think, to sort of see that victory. I think, though, outside of Washington, those are solutions to problems many folks don't know exist. And so I think we have to keep making sure they know why we want to expand the court. It's not, I don't think it's unpopular because people are just like upset about the idea. I don't think they understand how that will solve the problem, and I think we've got to do a better job of that. I think a bigger, maybe 1,000 feet up about this is that people also just think that that stuff isn't possible. And I really believe that we have to show and tell why these reforms are possible and necessary. I think necessary is because, for all the reasons that we've talked about, but also why in 2024 are we living with the rules and institutions from 300 years ago, right? Like, imagine if we were all responsible for writing the Constitution for the year 3025, and we don't know technology, we don't know national security, the economy, but those folks would have to be stuck with what we decide they should do. And so I think it is necessary to reform and ensure that these institutions are meeting the current moment. And then I think possible because none of the changes we all enjoy was inevitable, right? It wasn't inevitable that I could vote as a black woman. It wasn't inevitable that I could marry my wife, right? And even maybe not as big as that, it wasn't inevitable that we could have clean air on airplanes, right? Like, we've done really big stuff before, and I think we just have to sort of inject positive possibility back into our culture, in American culture. And I just think a little bit of that's missing because you talk about adding seats to the Supreme Court and folks are like, what? What would James Madison think?
That is at the top of voters' minds.
Nobody knows who James Madison
What
was.
does Federalist Paper 10 say about this?
Okay, do I have 1 minute to
Yes,
make one
yeah,
more
please.
serious point? Although I actually like those 2 other ideas. I do think that whatever reforms, if we ever get to a day where Democrats are passing court reforms, there needs to be thinking about how to, because reforming the court doesn't necessarily undo 20 years of Roberts Court jurisprudence. And unlike in the Lochner era, and forgive me if I mangle the history a little bit, but like, they didn't have like one theory and change a bunch of laws around it and then, well, never mind, we take that back and so we can sort of reestablish the old order easily. They made up a new jurisprudence on voting rights, they made up a new jurisprudence on gun rights, they made up a new jurisprudence on executive power, and none of it coheres, right? It's just, any port in the storm. Whatever they decided they needed Republicans to do or wanted Republicans to have, that's what they did. And so you can take seats away or you can add seats, you can rebalance the court and make it more representative of the country, but then you have, and now what? Well, if you wait for litigation to undo all the damage that's been done over 20 years, it might take another 20 years. And so people ought to think about christening the McConnell-Roberts era and being prepared to quickly undo the worst things that have been done by legislation when there's a court that won't say that piece of legislation is also out the door.
Thank you, panelists. We're going to take some questions, but I just wanted to pick up, sorry, moderator's privilege. I just want to pick up one thing that you said, Brian, which is that this idea, I've heard people say this and it kind of drives me nuts, so don't say this in front of me. But this idea that's like, oh, the court did this thing that, kneecap federal regulations, that could be good, right? If Trump wins again and he tries to wield the federal agencies to do harm to people, to women, immigrants, whoever it might be, then the court will restrain Trump's worst impulses, right? Because they issued this ruling that says Joe Biden's federal agencies aren't allowed to do anything. No, dude, no. It's just what Brian said. They are inventing these legal doctrines that are not intended to be coherent in any way. They're not even really doctrines. They made them up as a way to pick and choose the things that they don't like. They've given themselves the power to do this now. They've crowned themselves the deciders of what we get to keep and lose. And they get to pick and choose the policies that they don't like, that their wealthy benefactors don't like either, and they will pick and choose those things and get rid of them. This is not a matter of like, oh, well, fair is fair. When Trump's president, they'll say, oh, you can't tell DHS to, do the worst possible thing you can imagine at the border. That's not how this works. This is about power, to Stasha's point. This is about wielding power in the most harmful ways that you can imagine. So on that note, does anyone have any questions? Let's go. Yeah, here. I don't know. Do you need a mic? Just talk really loud.
I did cheer for a long time. Hi, my name is Leah. Thank you so much for the roast of the Supreme Court.
You are welcome.
Thank you. I'm in Florida, by the way. Governor Ron DeSatan, as we call him, lives there. Anyways, my question is more centered towards our younger people who are the give no fucks generation, the take no shit generation. And so I find myself when I'm talking to people about expansion of the court, especially how great it could be, but what tactics or messaging would you provide us young people when we're talking to these folks that may have fear that what happens when the opposition, let's say we expand the court and we're successful, what's to stop the fear of the opposition getting a hold and then kind of taking over in that manner? That's something I've been running into a lot.
I'm the moderator, but can I answer that? Okay. Listen, I hear this all the time. I used to work on court expansion more specifically in my previous life. And we used to hear that all the time, like, well, what about this tit for tat? Well, if we do this, then won't Republicans do this? That they already did. We're in the tit for tat. We're in the tat now. Like, it's time to stop governing from a place of like, ooh, but if we do something good now, Republicans might do something bad later. It's like, of course they're going to do something bad later. You could do nothing now and they would still do something bad later. The point being, like Merrick Garland, for example. What did Democrats do to induce that behavior of holding up his nomination? Nothing, other than existing, right? So Republicans are always going to do something bad. So the question is not like, ooh, should we hold back on doing something because Republicans might do something bad? It's like, no, what if we do something really amazing and really big and really huge and dare Republicans to do something about it if they get power back? That's really the answer to that question. Sasha.
Can I just, a quick, on the young people part, I think one thing that we have to keep thinking and talking about is the reason we want folks, there are a number of reasons, but we want voters to know about this stuff so that they can pressure members of Congress. And I think, folks like Dick Durbin are able to just chill out and not do anything because he's not feeling enough pressure from his constituents and voters. And I think young people have proven to have the power to get attention and make noise. And so I think J-Mo might have mentioned the frontline members. Like, we have to be able to get young people to create chaos around this. Otherwise, just members are able to not do anything about Clarence Thomas or Alito or any of these folks.
Thank you. I think we have time for two more. Let's go over here, because I haven't done that side of the room yet. Yes?
Yeah, so I think that the point about the judiciary in general being sort of opaque and confusing and that being one of the reasons that people don't have a lot of knowledge about it is really valid. And I was wondering if you have any examples, because I'm struggling to think of it, of other things like that where there's been such a big gap, there was just such a big lack of knowledge or lack of interest in the general voting population, and that we have been able to change that to the point of getting it so that people will call on a regular basis. And I think that's my big concern is what examples historically would we use to figure out this is sort of our pattern for getting more than 35% of people to know that people were appointed by Republicans and all that.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is the filibuster.
Yep, that's what I was going to say.
I think it's not like people rallied around the filibuster because they care about Senate rules and procedure. They hate the filibuster because it's preventing them from getting stuff that they want. The Supreme Court's the exact same thing, just on the opposite end. It's taking away the thing that you had. So I think that might be one parallel example of getting people excited about something that on its face is kind of boring and stale, but...
Yeah, I would just second the filibuster. When I started as a journalist, it was bog standard for headline writers and news reporters when Republicans typically, but any party would filibuster legislation that Senate kills blank, not like the minority in the Senate is responsible for making sure this doesn't come up for a vote. And it took the whole 20 years to make the abuse of the filibuster, which began about 20 years ago, well enough understood in the press corps and among Democrats in Congress to get a clearer communication about how the filibuster worked, who's responsible for killing legislation in the Senate. It's just not like a very hopeful, like it makes it seem like it's going to take a similar amount of time to get people's heads to connect Supreme Court rulings with consequences, with the asterisk being that I think Dobbs and whatever happens to a future Dobbs or Roe codification bill might speed that up a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly say, I think a lot of people, a ton of people do care about the Supreme Court. They just haven't, a lot of them haven't yet made the connection to a party and to what they can do about it. And so we don't have to like convince them to understand this arcane thing. We just have to tell them, hey, look, this is the Republican Party, and here's something we can do about it.
Okay, one more super fast, yes.
Thanks. So, appreciated this, and I work in the nonprofit world, so I have a...
I'm so sorry.
I disagree a little bit with Sasha about that activist community, because I've been disappointed. I think the groups that work on the Supreme Court have done an amazing job, but the left and activist community as a whole hasn't really embraced the work that needs to be done on it. And a case in point is that like they're showing their protests in the street and ready to go when the unity decision came down. And even within the recent rulings against federal action, I've been in a number of meetings where it's really challenging for nonprofiters to really take it seriously, activist groups, and figure out how to talk about it because it's not our lane or we don't have the exact right thing that we want to tell everybody to do. And so even just being the messaging out about how dangerous this is in the Supreme Court has been to all of the work that we've done has been challenging. So what are the ways to think not just about the party, but sort of the left ecosystem as a whole to take this seriously and start working on it?
I was so excited when you said you disagree with me because I thought it was going to be something that we can like go back. I agree with you too. Like I meant when I said the advocates, I really mean the folks who've been working on court reform. I think they've been pushing and they've been ignored largely by some of our nonprofit friends. Just like I worked on a while ago a filibuster campaign, and we were thank you. and we would pick up the phone and call. I'm not going to say which organizations, some repro groups. We would call and say, hey, could you join this campaign about eliminating the filibuster? And they'd be like, oh, are you kidding me? And then 5 years later, they're like, where do we sign for that filibuster thing? So I am deeply frustrated with our nonprofit friends. I think over time, maybe it's because I have kids or because I'm getting older, but I understand that these changes for the groups they are afraid of them, and I sort of understand the fear, but I also am frustrated because I think we have this learned behavior to push back against power. And so I agree with you. I guess the thing I will say, because of Dobbs, a lot of issue groups are starting to see the connectivity. So a lot of issue groups are talking about how filibuster connects to their issue. A lot of groups are talking about how the court connects. Not enough. And I often say that we have to organize our allies, that we have to have a persuasion campaign with our allies. So I agree with you too.
I'll just add one thing. I hope you're not implying that it's difficult to get the left to act in unison. No, but seriously, like, People who have been around for a while, don't know if you know this, JMO and I worked at Media Matters for America together 15, 20 years ago. And back then, liberals were finally kind of starting to realize, oh, you know, conservatives are really good. Like, everybody getting on board with everybody else's issue and acting and all moving in the same direction. And I don't know how many meetings we went to, were like trying to get liberals all together to do the same thing. And what we would say to them at the time was, whatever issue is your issue, the news media is something you have to care about because it is going to make a difference. The same thing is true of the courts and the Supreme Court. Whatever your issue it is, this is also your issue. And so everybody, no matter what they do, whether it's in guns or the environment or labor rights or whatever it is, this is something that is going to determine whether or not you make the progress that you need to see. So
I was literally just going to say that.
Okay, Stasha, but we're way over time.
I know we're way over time, but I didn't
Hurry
plug
up.
in my things at the beginning. Please go to unitedfordemocracy.us. And or even better, the amazing Jen Mandelblatt's here,
Yes.
where you've probably seen her name in all the emails, and she runs the show. And so reach out to her if you're interested on how to get involved and help us make noise about the court.
Thank you. On
one
that
on that.
note, we're
Take back
wrapping
the
her
court.
up. You can find all their websites in the booklet. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to our panelists. We'll stick around for more questions. Thank you.